In 27 BC, Augustus inherited a crumbling republic and transformed it into history's most dominant empire. But what nobody knows is that his entire rise to power was orchestrated through a conspiracy so elaborate that it rewrote Western civilization. And he wasn't alone. Every empire that ever existed was built on hidden conspiracies that shaped the course of history. Today, we're exposing all of them. In the year 44 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated by members of the Senate he trusted. But what most historians ignore is that his death was just the first move in a 15-year conspiracy orchestrated by his adopted heir, Augustus, and his general Mark Antony. They didn't move against Caesar's assassins immediately. Instead, they waited. They built alliances. They purged thousands of potential rivals through the proscription lists, essentially creating death squads that eliminated 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians. Over 130,000 people were murdered in 5 years of calculated elimination. The real conspiracy was this: Augustus disguised absolute power as a restoration of the Republic. He kept the Senate intact, but stripped it of real authority. Citizens believed they still lived in a republic. They didn't. Augustus had weaponized institutions to concentrate power so perfectly that the empire lasted 500 years because nobody realized the republic was already dead. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Political opposition disappeared. Dynasties became inevitable, and a model of hidden authoritarianism was born, one that every empire after would replicate. By the way, if you love uncovering the hidden truths behind history, don't forget to subscribe. We post these exposés weekly. In the 14th century AD, the Ottoman Empire introduced one of history's most brilliant and horrifying conspiracies, the Devşirme system. On the surface, it was a meritocratic recruitment program. Young Christian boys were taken from their families and trained to become the Sultan's elite soldiers, the Janissaries. Between 1365 and 1625, approximately 200,000 boys were forcibly removed from their homes. They were castrated, converted to Islam, and transformed into fanatically loyal warriors. The conspiracy was genius. The Ottoman rulers convinced the population that this was an honor, that these boys were receiving the greatest opportunity of their lives. Parents didn't resist, they celebrated. But the real genius was in the control mechanism. By training soldiers who had no family ties, no property, and no rival loyalties, the sultans created an unbreakable military force. The Janissaries never rebelled against the throne because they had no one to protect but their master. For 260 years, this conspiracy kept the Ottoman Empire stable and militarily dominant across 3 continents. The irreversible consequence was devastating. A generation of men stolen from their heritage, their families destroyed, and an empire built on psychological manipulation that outlasted every competitor of its era. In 1773, the British East India Company faced a problem. China had everything the West wanted: silk, tea, porcelain, but the Chinese wanted nothing in return. Trade was impossible. So the company devised a conspiracy so effective that it would give them control of the most populous nation on earth. They flooded China with opium. By 1835, 12 million Chinese citizens were addicted. By 1900, over 27% of the male population was dependent on the drug. The genius of the conspiracy was this: it was legal. The British government protected the trade. When China tried to ban opium imports, Britain went to war, twice, to force the narcotics trade open. These were called the Opium Wars, and they weren't wars at all. They were genocide through chemistry. Between 1800 and 1950, the opium conspiracy destabilized China so completely that its entire governmental structure collapsed. The Qing dynasty fell. Regional warlords took power. Civil wars devastated the nation. Over 30 million people died directly or indirectly from the conspiracy, and the British became the wealthiest empire in human history by systematically destroying an entire civilization through pharmacological control. This conspiracy never disappeared. It simply evolved. Western pharmaceutical companies today operate using the exact same playbook. This is getting intense. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. We're just getting started with how empires really work. In 1519, Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico with 600 men and a conspiracy so psychological that it would conquer an empire of 5 million people in just 3 years. He didn't need more soldiers. He needed myths. Cortés spread a rumor. He was the return of Quetzalcoatl, the Aztec god prophesied to arrive from across the ocean. The Aztec emperor Montezuma, terrified by this supposed prophecy, invited Cortés into his capital, Tenochtitlan. Once inside, Cortés executed a second conspiracy. He took Montezuma hostage and used him as a puppet to destabilize the entire empire from within. Montezuma died, killed by his own people who believed he was a traitor. The Aztec Empire collapsed. But here's what's crucial. Cortés didn't defeat 5 million people with military superiority. He defeated them with psychological manipulation. The conspiracy worked so perfectly that the Aztecs destroyed themselves. Over the next 50 years, the Spanish conspiracy expanded. They introduced diseases, intentionally and unintentionally, that killed 90% of the indigenous population. Approximately 56 million people died. The Spanish didn't conquer Mexico through force. They conquered it through conspiracy, deception, and biological warfare, and they rebranded it as civilization. In 1922, Vladimir Lenin established the Soviet Union with a promise, a workers' paradise where class distinctions would disappear. What followed was the largest conspiracy of paranoia in human history, orchestrated by Joseph Stalin. Beginning in 1934, Stalin initiated what historians called the Great Purge. But purge is a euphemism. It was a systematic conspiracy to eliminate anyone who could threaten his power. Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, conducted over 750,000 executions in just 3 years. Officers were given execution quotas. Sometimes they arrested random people just to meet their numbers. The conspiracy's genius was this. Stalin created a culture of fear so pervasive that citizens reported neighbors, family members, and colleagues to secret police. Between 1930 and 1953, approximately 20 million people died in Stalin's labor camps, purges, and famines. But the terrifying part was this. Most of it was unnecessary for maintaining power. Stalin perpetuated the conspiracy because the conspiracy itself had become the structure of government. The empire was sustained not by loyalty, but by terror. And it worked for 70 years because nobody could organize resistance when they couldn't trust their own family. The result was an empire that never recovered from its own paranoia. It collapsed less than 40 years after Stalin's death because the conspiracy had become unsustainable. In 1953, the American government orchestrated a conspiracy in Iran that would shape global politics for 70 years. The CIA and British intelligence staged a coup against Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, because he threatened to nationalize the oil industry. The conspiracy wasn't violent, not at first. They spread propaganda through newspapers they controlled. They organized protests through opposition groups they funded. They created the narrative that Mossadegh was a communist threat when he wasn't. Within months, he was overthrown and replaced with a dictator, the Shah, who would remain in power for 26 years through constant American support. But here's the genius of this conspiracy. It was invisible. Most Americans never even knew it happened. The American empire maintained its power not through direct military occupation, though that happened too, but through something far more subtle, the creation of false narratives that made imperialism seem like democracy promotion. Between 1950 and 2010, the United States orchestrated over 50 regime change conspiracies in countries across Latin America, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Over 3 million people died in these conflicts, but the conspiracy was so successful that most Americans believed their country was spreading freedom. The empire survived because the conspiracy convinced its own citizens it wasn't committing conspiracies at all. If you're watching this, you understand that history isn't what we were taught in school. Subscribe right now so you never miss these hidden truths. The algorithm won't show you this content unless you actively support it. From 221 BC onward, Chinese emperors mastered a conspiracy that would last 2,000 years, the rewriting of history itself. When an emperor wanted to eliminate a political rival, they didn't just execute them, they erased them from official records. Entire periods of history were rewritten, achievements were reassigned, blame was shifted. The conspiracy was so effective that historians today often can't distinguish truth from propaganda in ancient Chinese history. But the conspiracy didn't stop with dynasties. In 1989, the Chinese government orchestrated a modern version, the conspiracy of forced forgetting. After the Tiananmen Square protests, the government didn't just suppress the memory, it actively erased it from education, media, and public discourse. The conspiracy worked so completely that young Chinese citizens today have never even heard of the event that killed thousands of their countrymen. The empire survived not by hiding the truth, but by making it impossible for citizens to even conceive that the truth existed. It's the most advanced form of conspiracy ever created, making people forget to even ask questions. Now that we've examined individual conspiracies, let's identify the pattern. Every empire in history followed the same basic conspiracy structure, with variations. Step 1. Create a false narrative. Augustus called his dictatorship a restoration. The British called genocide trade. The Americans call military occupation democracy promotion. The conspiracy always begins with language that makes the indefensible sound inevitable. Step 2. Eliminate alternative narratives. China rewrites history. Stalin murdered intellectuals. The British controlled media in their colonies. Every empire removes competing stories because the empire's survival depends on monopolizing the narrative. Step 3. Make the conspiracy invisible. The most successful empires aren't the ones where people know they're being controlled. They're the ones where people believe they're free. The Devşirme system convinced families their children were being honored. The opium wars convinced consumers they were just buying a commodity. American regime change convinced voters their country was spreading democracy. When the conspiracy is invisible, it becomes unbreakable. Step 5. Bind people to the system. Augustus created dynasties. The Ottoman Empire created janissaries with no other family. The Soviet Union created terror networks. The American Empire created consumer dependency. Every empire survives by making it practically impossible for people to imagine life outside the system. Step 6. Redefine the conspiracy as natural order. After a few generations, people stop seeing the conspiracy at all. It becomes just how things are. That's when the empire is most secure. That's also when it's most vulnerable. History isn't a series of random events. It's a pattern of conspiracies so consistent that we can predict when the next empire will fall. And if you understand that pattern, you'll see it happening in real time everywhere around you. Thanks for watching.